At 5:18 on May 10th, 1940, a German panzer column was snaking through the Ardennes forest near Bouillon. A persistent drizzle hung in the air, and a heavy white fog clung to the oak trees, turning the dirt road into a muddy paste. Low hills stacked upon each other, in layers of dark green. The roar of the engines echoed between the rain-soaked trees, sounding like drums in a cave. The column moved slowly, one vehicle at a time, the narrow lane offering no other option. Headlights were carefully shuttered. Tank tracks churned through the mud, leaving behind a trail of fuel and exhaust. Inside the lead command tank, a German officer tapped the radio, receiving an immediate response. Here, Blitzkrieg wasn't just a word. It was a living, breathing thing, powered by roaring engines, guided by crackling wires, and executed with ruthless precision. Above the trees, reconnaissance aircraft silently scanned the Meuse River, not seeking massive battles, but hunting for vulnerabilities. A bridge, a critical junction, a vulnerable battery. Further back, at a forward staff truck, maps were spread across the tailgate. Red arrows, symbolizing the planned advance, cut through the Ardennes like arteries on a body. The Allies were convinced this forest was impassable for tanks moving at speed. The Germans were about to turn that belief into their advantage. Within the column, early Panzer IIIs lumbered forward. Their frontal armor ranged from 30 to 50 millimeters, depending on the production batch. The turrets were armed with a 37 millimeters KWK-36 cannon, though some had already been upgraded with short 50 millimeters guns. According to some sources, the effective anti-armor range of the 37 millimeters gun was roughly 500 to 800 meters against lightly armored vehicles. Each crew member focused intently on the rear of the tank ahead, maintaining a precise one-hull spacing. A traffic jam in this dense forest was unthinkable. If the column stalled, the entire spearhead would die. Fuel trucks followed close behind, mere inches from the tanks. Engineers rode alongside, carrying pontoons, demolition charges, and wire cutters. Blitzkrieg depended on speed, but it could be crippled by a missing bridge or an empty fuel tank. Thus, the steel teeth and the supply chain moved together as one. Up ahead, Stukas were gathering in formation. The distinctive profile of the Ju-87 dive bomber was already etched into memories of German soldiers from countless drills, near vertical dives, a 250 kilograms bomb slung on the fuselage, and many aircraft also carrying 450 kilograms bombs beneath the wings, the standard loadout for the early war. The terrifying Jericho trumpet siren wailed, designed not just to kill, but to paralyze the enemy with fear. Inside a panzer hull, a young sergeant named Franz, a fictional character, sat with his ear flap cap pulled down. He nervously bit a pencil and scribbled in a small notebook. "Mother, we're in the forest. I don't know when we reach the river. It's cold rain here." He carefully folded the note and slipped it into his breast pocket, next to a photo of his sister. He hadn't mailed it yet. Blitzkrieg didn't allow for such pauses. Across the forest, a French platoon prepared a roadblock on the asphalt. They were armed with a few 25 millimeters Hotchkiss anti-tank guns, capable of firing 15 to 20 rounds per minute with an effective range of around 500 meters, according to some sources. They anticipated the German armor to advance slowly along main roads, supported by infantry in a methodical crawl. They were about to experience a completely different kind of warfare. What was Blitzkrieg? As experienced at 5:18 in the Ardennes, it was a carefully orchestrated formula. Asterisk layer of finding seams asterisk reconnaissance, and air power led the way, searching for weaknesses rather than directly challenging strong points. Asterisk layer of striking points asterisk artillery and dive bombers would hit these weak points hard and fast, punching a hole in the enemy lines. Asterisk layer of driving deep asterisk tanks and motorized infantry would then slip through the breach, racing into the enemy's rear. Asterisk layer of sealing mouse asterisk following forces would then wrap around, transforming the breakthrough into a complete encirclement. No layer could function in isolation. Without reliable radio communication, a deep thrust would quickly become lost and ineffective. Without the Stukas, the point strike would lose its crucial tempo. Without a steady stream of supplies, the entire operation would grind to a halt. This method was born from the bitter lessons of World War I. where trenches stretching for hundreds of kilometers and artillery barges firing thousands of shells per minute still resulted in infantry bogged down in mud and barbed wire. Germany was determined not to repeat that horrific stalemate. They envisioned war as a constant, relentless motion. The drizzle continued. The column pressed on towards Meuse. At 12:46 that same day, at Sedan, the sky was gray. River mist mingled with the acrid smoke of battle. German artillery rolled up to the wooded riverbank. 105mm Luft-18 howitzers began to fire. These guns, with a caliber of 105mm and a maximum range of about 6 kilometers, could sustain a rate of fire of around 4 to 6 rounds per minute. But instead of an hours-long bombardment, common in 1916, they focused their fire for only 15 to 20 minutes, targeting specific French strongpoints. As soon as the guns fell silent, the Stukas immediately dove in, denying the defenders any chance to recover. German infantry rushed across the water in rubber boats, while engineers frantically threw pontoons into place. French machine gun fire swept the river, but the Stukas had already neutralized many of the gun nests. The surviving defenders were stunned and disoriented. Blitzkrieg thrived in this exact moment, when the enemy was still alive, but completely off balance. A hole was opening in the French defenses. Franz heard the order over the radio. Across the river in 30 minutes. No halt. The panzers surged forward. Their tracks climbed the riverbank, slipped on the wet grass, found purchase, and charged on. Fuel trucks shadowed them closely. On the ridge, French soldiers desperately sprinted towards their commanders. Telephone lines were cut, and radio posts were reduced to rubble. They didn't realize the German spearhead had already slipped behind them. The first crest of the Blitzkrieg wave was taking shape, the order of speed. The enemy hadn't collapsed yet, but they had lost their footing. Blitzkrieg wasn't just about fighting fast, winning fast. It was about striking swiftly at the precise weak point, then racing into the resulting void. It used a relatively small force at the seam to create massive strategic consequences. Evening fell on the banks of the Meuse, amid the scattered shell casings and the lingering smell of wet smoke. A French soldier found a half-written letter on the floor of a command dugout. To Marie today, the ink stopped where the bombs had fallen. He folded the letter and tucked it into the coat of the dead writer. On the German side, Franz glanced at his sister's photo for 2 seconds, then slipped it back into his pocket. He had no idea where he would be tomorrow. Blitzkrieg turned maps into fleeting things, changing by the hour. At 15:07 on May 21st, 1940, the open field between Mercatel and Tilloy, southwest of Arras, were bathed in the pale sun after the previous night's rain. A cold wind swept through the young wheat. The ground was soft, the tank tracks sinking deep. Low hedgerows and red brick villages dotted the horizon. No mountains, no Sikh forties, just open land, exposed to the eyes of enemy aircraft. The German spearhead had arrived here after crossing the Meuse, believing its rear was secure. Supply roads were stretched thin like a fragile thread. That thread was now pulled taut. Some infantry battalions lagged far behind. The tanks in front were mixed with fuel and ammunition trucks, creating a vulnerable logistical bottleneck. This was the underside of Blitzkrieg. When the tempo became too frantic, the strain on logistics became painfully obvious. Rommel, in his command vehicle, scanned a map spread across the hood. Non-stop radio chatter filled the air. Fuel trucks burning, enemy tanks from Arras. He looked up. On the northern dirt road, dust billowed into a gray ribbon. It wasn't refugees. It was British tanks. Frankfurt was surging out in a counterattack. Matilda I and Matilda II tanks rolled in the column. They were slow, but their armor was so thick that standard 37mm Panzer III guns and German anti-tank rounds simply ricocheted off them like hail, as battlefield reports described. German crews watched in disbelief as the squat, boxy turrets advanced, their 37mm rounds having no effect. The Blitzkrieg rhythm slammed into an unexpected steel wall. A Panzer II platoon at the edge of a village was crushed. One tank couldn't reverse quickly enough. A Matilda crawled over it, its tracks grinding across an anti-tank gun, and its crew in their pit. The earth erupted with screams. German infantry flattened themselves in ditches, letting the tanks roll past before firing on the British foot soldiers who were trailing far behind. The British thrust was stretched out. Its tempo wasn't based on seamless radio, tank, Stuka coordination, but on separate blocks struggling to converge. In a shallow shell scrape, a German sergeant named Franz, a fictional character as before, heard tank tracks tearing closer. He pressed himself into the dirt, smelling crushed grass and gasoline fumes. He gripped his Kar 98K rifle like a lifeline in a metal storm. He thought of the unsent letter, soft in his pocket against the hard roar approaching him. Rommel had no time for introspection. He shouted into the radio, "Build a gun line now. Every tube to the open lane." This was Blitzkrieg's second crucial characteristic, the ability to adapt quickly within the chaos of battle. German crews dragged the 8 centimeters flak 1836 guns onto a low rise. The 88 millimeters barrel was long, and the outriggers were slammed wide. Hands spun the traverse wheels until knuckles turned white. With a muzzle velocity of around 840 meters per second and a veteran firing rate of 15 to 20 rounds per minute, the 88 could fire flat and penetrate heavy armor at long range. For the Matildas, this was the first real threat they encountered. At 15:24, the 88s opened fire. The first round slammed into the side of Matilda at a few hundred meters. The turret jolted, and the tank shuddered to a halt. The second round arrived, then the third. Within minutes, a line of British armor was pinned down in the open. German 105mm Luftwaffe-18 field guns were also dragged forward, firing directly at the enemy. Built for arcing fire, they now fired low to decimate the infantry escorts with fragmentation rounds. The wheat field churned as if boiling. British infantry scattered, but there was no cover to be found. They had chosen open ground to strike quickly, and that open ground was now devouring them. Then the Luftwaffe returned. When the Stukas arrived, the very air seemed to scream. Ju-87s dove from the sky, their Jericho sirens wailing, 250 kilograms bombs slamming into the British units attempting to turn around. Blitzkrieg regained its tempo by bringing air power back into the equation at precisely the right moment. On the British side, a captain unfolded a map inside his command tank. He realized he had pushed deeper than planned, but had no reserves to capitalize on the success. British radios were incompatible with French networks. Units paused because they couldn't determine each other's locations. They had landed a punch, but there was no weight behind it. By late afternoon, Frank force was retreating. The numbers told a clear story. The British-French attacker, fielding around 88 tanks, lost roughly 60 vehicles in the fighting. Only a few Matilda IIs destroyed, while Germany lost around 37 tanks and suffered several hundred casualties. These figures weren't just accounting. They were the pulse of two different approaches. Britain struck hard but couldn't maintain the momentum. Germany stumbled, then quickly recovered its rhythm. Franz sat against the wheel of an 88, his ears ringing. He took out his sister's photo. The edges were damp. He wiped it with his sleeve. He said nothing. A gunner beside him offered a cigarette. Their hands shook, having just emerged from the feeling of being crushed. This was a human reality beneath the military doctrine, not history. Just surviving another hour, Arras was a crack in the seemingly invincible Blitzkrieg. It didn't shatter the entire edifice, but it proved that Blitzkrieg wasn't magic. It could be stopped by thick armor, open terrain, and an enemy willing to launch a counterattack against a flank. Yet it also demonstrated Blitzkrieg's strength, flexible, combined arms tempo. Germany improvised a gun line, called in the Stukas on time, and used radio communication to shift direction in minutes. That tempo transformed a dangerous situation into a controlled retreat. After Arras, the German High Command briefly panicked. They saw their flank exposed. But once the rhythm was reestablished, the Spear continued its drive to the sea, completing the encirclement at Dunkirk. Blitzkrieg crossed chaos like a runner crossing mud. Slip, brace, rise, sprint again. At 6:02 on May 26, 1940, the beach at Dunkirk was a scene of desperation. The sky was silver gray. A northwest wind snapped in gusts. Short waves crashed on sand. Oil smoke from burning ships smeared black across the waterline. Onshore, thousands of British and French soldiers stood in long, dark lines, their helmets glittering like fish scales under the fine drizzle. Behind them, German armor was closing in. The Blitzkrieg spear had curved around northern France, trapping the Allied armies in a corner against the sea. From above, the strategic situation was clear. A breach at Sedan, a deep drive to the Channel, and a closing trap. On the ground, it felt like a knife hurting men towards the water. But at the moment the spear should have plunged deepest, it stalled. The halt order was issued to the panzer groups around Dunkirk on May 24th to 26th. While many sources debate the motives, marshy terrain, fear of tank losses, and the belief that the Luftwaffe alone could crush the pocket, Blitzkrieg was bending its own tempo for political decisions and risk aversion. Britain seized this opportunity to launch Operation Dynamo, evacuating over 330,000 troops across the Channel. According to common estimates, on the sand, a British sergeant raised his whistle and blew short bursts to keep the line steady. In his hand was a photo of his wife, received at Calais. Salt stained the edges from when he had fallen. While wading to a boat, he slipped it inside his coat as Stuka screamed overhead again. Humans clung to paper the way they clung to the shore. Stukas continued to dive, and 250 kilograms bombs detonated on the piers. MG-34 fire raked the beach. But when Blitzkrieg lacked its final, decisive layer, it became a hammer striking a pocket that already had an escape route. Blitzkrieg was strongest when all layers were perfectly synchronized. It weakened when one layer was removed from the rhythm. Less than 2 weeks later, the German spear turned south. Case red began. The pattern repeated. Punch, drive, encircle. This time, France was exhausted. The Somme and Aisne lines collapsed. Paris fell on June 14th, and France signed the armistice on June 22nd. The campaign totals felt as cold as iron. Germany suffered approximately 27,000 dead and over 110,000 wounded. The Allies suffered around 73,000 dead, 240,000 wounded, and over 7 million captured. The world was stunned not by the raw numbers alone, but by the speed at which they were produced. A smaller scene illustrates how Blitzkrieg was practical, rather than some mystical force. A Panzer IV Aus, be halted at the edge of a village. Its turret carried the 7.5 centimeters KWK 37L/24 gun, with caliber 75 millimeters and a rate of fire of about 12 to 15 rounds per minute. It was a close support weapon, not an ideal tank killer, designed to throw high-explosive rounds into houses, crossroads, and machine gun nests. Blitzkrieg didn't require every tank to be a duelist. It needed every tank to play its part at the right time in a fast-moving orchestra. Yet cracks were already appearing. In many sectors, German armor outran the infantry. Columns stopped for fuel, for collapsed bridges, for roads clogged with refugees. Blitzkrieg achieved its initial successes because distances were short. As the fronts lengthened, the tempo was strained by the sheer scale of the space. In 1941, that tempo collided with its greatest challenge, the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa opened like a Blitzkrieg textbook. 3 armored thrusts driving deep, air power smashing forward airfields, and massive encirclements at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev, according to some sources. But Russia was seemingly endless. Roads were in terrible condition. Mud season, and then winter swallowed the tracks. Logistics stretched to the breaking point. The Red Army lost millions in the first year, yet refused collapse, trading space for time, according to some sources. Blitzkrieg began to falter. It couldn't seal the mouth of a front that was simply too wide. At Stalingrad and Kursk, the Soviets responded with concentrated artillery and layered defensive depth. At Kursk, trenches, minefields, and anti-tank fire created anti-Blitzkrieg by attrition, turning speed into a slow, grinding slog, according to some synthetic studies. Blitzkrieg didn't disappear entirely. It was relegated to one tool among many, rather than a solo performance. So what was Blitzkrieg after these 3 major campaigns? It was a high-tempo, combined arms offensive doctrine designed to create psychological shock, shatter command systems, and achieve rapid encirclements. It relied on surprise, radio communication, mechanization, close air support, and robust logistics. It failed when distance stretched supply lines too thin, when enemy refused to panic and retreated in an orderly fashion, or when political interference disrupted the tempo. Its strategic legacy is evident on the 1940 map. Western Europe changed color in just 6 weeks. Afterward, armies worldwide began to reframe war as an interconnected system of armor, air power, and information. Later NATO and Warsaw Pact doctrines both echoed the principles of breakthrough, deep thrust, encirclement. Tactical radio, mobile command, and campaign-level precision airstrikes became standard practice. Memories were mixed. Germans remembered overnight engine runs and the feeling of winning history. The French remembered divisions collapsing more from communication failures than from sheer losses. The British remembered Dunkirk as a salt-stained photograph that survived the war. Franz, if he survived the war, would remember Arras and the Meuse, and a tempo where he was both a small cog and a human nearly crushed by the machine. Blitzkrieg wasn't simply about fighting fast. It was about fighting fast in synchronized minutes, using speed to alter the structure of the battlefield before the enemy could fully grasp what was happening. Its ultimate lesson was simple. Speed could open a door in history, but history always has enough depth to swallow anyone who believes they can sprint forever without tiring.